a superpower in spectacular decline. Once at the top of the democratic food chain and the political food chain, then it's faced with economic uncertainty, civil unrest, the elite struggling to hang on to power, political friends stabbing each other in the back, the threat of tyranny, and the uneasy restoration of democracy. I am, of course, talking about Athens 2,500 years ago. And it was under these conditions, these crumbling certainties, from which Socrates emerged. Socrates, at a time of massive change, gave the world dialectical philosophy, something that's hugely important through Plato, thanks to influenced by Heraclitus and, of course, Parmenides, and culminating in Aristotle. Dialectical philosophy is a great gift that we should embrace. Change is everywhere, as the ancient Greeks knew only too well. And school children today are faced with massive, rapid, and unprecedented changes, constitutional and, of course, environmental, as well as technological. But we are still not giving them the resources and the skills they need to be able to face these changes in the future. So the CBI's latest report from 2019 on education states that we aren't giving children skills that they need to face change. They include resilience, communication skills, so speaking and listening skills, and problem-solving skills.
So at the Philosophy Foundation, for the past 12 years, or getting on for 20 years in my case, we've been developing ways in which we can get young children from as young as 3 up to 19 to be able to do the kind of dialectical philosophy that Socrates was interested in. And by dialectical philosophy, I don't mean sort of sitting around and just sort of talking, sharing feelings and opinions, especially in this age of the sovereignty of opinion. We need something a little bit more robust. So we're talking about, something which is logical, conceptual, it's rigorous. But rather than talk about it and try and persuade you, I'd like to show you some children doing the kind of philosophy that Socrates was talking about. So I'll introduce you to the 4 R's of philosophy. I'd like to do so by showing you an instance of children doing each of these R's. So in the first case, we're dealing with, these are children from southeast London, regular state schools that we've worked in for many, many years. I'm going to start with Nadia. And the question I've put to the group is that well-known philosophical question. If a tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make sound?
There's a tree in the Sahara Desert, yeah? but nobody's seen it or nobody's touched it. But it's still there. It's still standing in that exact spot all the time, even though nobody's seen it or touched it or. No, but then nobody knows that it exists. It exists. So that's a.
Sounds like it's great, Nadia, to hear you thinking this through out loud.
And as I said to Nadia, it is great to hear us thinking this through out loud. You can kind of see or hear the moment when Nadia kind of encounters the philosophical problem there. She starts to recognise that there is one. And many of you, when you hear that tired old question, will often think, well, of course it makes a sound when it falls in the front. Of course it does, that's obvious, isn't it? But there's so much more to it. If there's not an ear there to interpret what's happening, is it truly a sound? And what exactly is a sound, etc., etc. And you can hear her kind of encountering a philosophical problem, seeing a problem for herself, what we call problem seeing. And this responsiveness is such a key thing in philosophy. Darwin said that the most successful species is not the strongest or the most intelligent, but that which is most responsive to change.
And she'd be very good in risk analysis.
So now we come to Alice, 8-year-old Alice. And I think I'd asked them to imagine that they were in a machine that shrinks, and they were going in this machine, this incredible shrinking machine, to explore or inquire into the micro world. It breaks, and it keeps shrinking. So then I simply asked them, what do you think is going to happen next?
Could something be so small that it doesn't even exist?
Oh, that's a good question.
Or it's so small that it can't exist?
So after having that story told to her, she's now entered a kind of reflective mode, a questioning mode, we could call it. It's an interesting mode where we kind of become unstable. Everything we're considering becomes unstable. The world shimmers with possibilities, rather than being this kind of fixed thing that we just bump into. That's what reflection does. But here's something to reflect on. When was the last time you were given an opportunity to reflect in your workplace? When was the last time your children were given an opportunity to reflect on what they were learning in school? Okay, that's the end of reflection time. Time to move on. Coming to the third R, we're going to, first of all, come to some science.
Yeah, we're going to go scientific, because they're very closely linked, philosophy and science. So this is from the New York Public Library Science Desk reference, a Macmillan book, The Physics of the Atom. The atom's name comes from the Greek word atomos, meaning indivisible. As early as 5 BC, it was proposed that all matter was composed of tiny particles called atoms, which could not be further broken down. Ernest Rutherford was the first to show that the atom is not the smallest unit of matter. And then again, in the 50 physics ideas you really need to know, the idea that matter is made up of swarms of tiny atoms has been around since the Greeks. But whereas the Greeks thought that the atom's the smallest indivisible component of matter, 20th century physicists realized this was not so and began to probe the inner structure of the atom itself.
In short, these books seem to assume that the Greeks had some idea about the atoms, but then it was proved wrong later on by modern science.
Let's hear what Roccos, age 8, thinks of that.
I'd asked them what they thought. Once the atom had been split, once Rutherford had split the atom, did that prove Democritus wrong? This is what 8-year-old Roccos said.
Technically, if they did split an atom, then that means Democritus is wrong. But it doesn't mean, just because they found something that's really small and split it, it doesn't mean that it is an atom. Because maybe they found something that's a bit bigger than an atom or something smaller.
Right.
They don't, like Lucian said, they don't have proof.
So for this third R, let me go into a little bit more detail about what Roccos is doing here. First of all, he says if they split an atom, then that means Democritus is wrong. So let's have a look at what he's doing in terms of his reasoning. He's thinking using inference making. If, then, okay? And he's started off by working on the same assumption the science books have. If it's split, then that proves Democritus wrong. But without even a beat, he then goes on to challenge his own assumption there with the next part of his reasoning, which is just because they found something that's really small and split it, it doesn't mean that it is an atom. Now here he's doing something different. Rather than making an inference, he's objecting to an inference or challenging an inference. And what's more, he goes on to provide a reason for that. Because maybe they found something that's a bit bigger than an atom or something smaller. I mean, it doesn't matter what we think about the reason we agree or disagree with that. But the point is, we can see, if you will, the atomic units of thought here. The basic thing that Socrates was interested in are inferences, what follows from what we're entitled to say follows from what, and stuff like that. This shows you that these children are working with the same tools that Socrates was, and they can also critically engage with each other's ideas, and in this case, even with his own idea. So this is the third R. Philosophy is a reasoning thing. It's not just sitting around sharing our thoughts and feelings, although it may be that too, but it has this rigorous aspect to it. It is a discipline. For the fourth R, we're going to return to Alice. So we're going to start off with Noah, but I'd like you to just draw attention to Alice here, who we met earlier. See how soon into Noah's ideas her hand goes up.
We need a classification for things that have no touch, smell, you can't, well, no properties, but do have consequences. We call them anti-things.
So things that don't have properties are called anti-things.
But they do have a consequence. So time, if you left a cloth in a drawer, it would get dusty. That is a consequence of time. Nothing, the consequence of nothing is that nothing solid exists. The consequence of existence is the exact opposite. Solids appear. So that would water. And also gravity or all forces, they have no properties, but their consequence, the consequence of gravity is that you will go down if you go up. The consequence of motion is that if you're going downhill, you will speed up. So that is anti-things, no properties, but they do have consequences. Wow.
Well, Ruckus was clearly impressed. And actually, this is the sort of thing that we might show people to really impress people with what children can do in the way of doing philosophy. And at first, this really does look very impressive. Noah has done an extremely good impression of Aristotle, I would say, here. Lots of interesting things. Metaphysics, abstraction, new ideas, neologisms. Loads of things there we might want to show off. But there is a crucial thing missing that we see in the exchange between Noah and Alice.
Oh, but you know when I said that it's an anti thing.
An anti-thing, yes.
Yeah. And it had no properties. But then you see, how could it be an anti-thing if it has no properties?
No, but it still has a consequence.
But how can it? But I mean, how can it have a name if it has no properties? How could it be a thing?
In that lovely film, we see Alice, as well as hearing the awful sound of Velcro that any teacher is the bane to any. We see Alice there critically engaging with Noah. And look, a week later, she came back and she'd been thinking about it, and she said this. We don't have the film, but we do have the transcript.
And she said this as soon as she walked in the room the next week. She was like, I've been thinking about this all week.
It's a thing, though, she said. It's something that exists, and everything that exists has a property. Like things that exist might have a property that they don't have a property, but that's a property, she said. An anti-thing couldn't be an anti-thing because it's a thing and it's impossible. So, I mean, Angie talked about children being able to spot self-refuting theories. Well, that's what she's done here. I mean, the middle bit shows that she's sensitive to the fact that this theory might be a self-refuting one, okay? And Noah is at least going to have to consider her thoughts. Notice this isn't just a sharing of opinions here. This is her critically engaging with those aspects, those logical aspects of what he said, his theory, that need engaging with and addressing. And he will need to either revise or reject his theory in light of Alice's ideas and thoughts. By the way, this principle that an existing entity must have at least one property is taught by Alan Hazlitt at the University of Edinburgh, and we've heard people say that they are taught Alice's principle. Wow. So the last of the R's is that philosophy is re-evaluative. We're rethinking, critically rethinking, not just sharing thoughts and opinions. And this means, of course, that yes, of course, we need education which is knowledge-based, and the children need to know a bunch of stuff, right? Absolutely, we're not arguing with that. But in addition to that, the children also need to learn what Dorothy says is called the lost tools of learning. The dialectical aspect, how we think, what we think about what we've learned, and the stuff that we know. This is the bit that is overlooked. Philosophy can meet.
These lost tools of learning can be summed up with metacognition, which the EEF, which is the Education Endowment Foundation, has shown improves learning across all subject areas. So if you can improve children's ability to think about their learning, to evaluate their learning and think about how they're going to make progress in their learning, then they're going to get better at learning. Funny that. Earlier on, I was talking about the changes that children are faced with, and Angie was talking about as well the post-truth and the fake news, and we've got deep fake videos now, for goodness sake. How on earth are we going to be able to separate fact from fiction? And critical thinking is one of the skills we can give children to be able to help them develop the right sorts of skills. Philosophy is closely linked with both metacognition and critical thinking. But there actually hasn't been much research done into measuring how that improves when you do philosophy. So in 2017, we got together with King's College London to really look at how much philosophical inquiry can improve critical thinking skills and metacognition. And we tested that against philosophical inquiry, but with the added element of teaching the critical thinking skills at the same time. So we had 20 classes over the course of 2 years. We just had one term each with these 20 classes. 10 of them had our normal philosophy sessions, and 10 had our philosophy sessions plus the intervention of teaching critical thinking and metacognition during the inquiry. So it wasn't a separate thing. They were using these skills during the inquiry. And what we found was that there is definitely an improvement in children's ability to successfully use critical thinking and metacognitive tools when they're taught it alongside philosophical inquiry. So there was a 60% improvement overall, and they made 10 times more progress than the control groups alone. The control groups did go up as well, so philosophical inquiry does help improve those things, but teaching it as well is a good thing to do. So we've started to incorporate that in our classes. We're now doing critical thinking with children in year 3 and up into secondary school. We haven't quite worked out how to do it with nursery school children, but we might get there eventually.
So yes, it is worth remembering, and I'm sure we'll hear some more stories later about the conferred benefits of philosophy, the instrumental reasons why we might want to do philosophy in schools. But I think it's also worth drawing our attention to the non-instrumental argument as well. A few years ago, a colleague of mine, Andy West, worked in Great Ormond Street Hospital, which is where we still work. And he was working with some children, one of whom was David. David was terminally ill with cancer, and David really enjoyed coming to philosophy. But after a few weeks of doing this, he found it increasingly difficult to be able to come. And the nurses eventually said, no, he can't come anymore because he's not well enough. So David, wanting to be part of the philosophy, they made a concession, said they video linked him in, which meant that Andy was able to continue to do the sessions with him. And on a few occasions, it was with just him, just the two of them, video linked in. And David clearly got an awful lot out of this. But there were no long-term benefits for him. His SATs weren't going to improve as a result of doing this. His reading and maths performance wasn't going to improve as a result of doing this. But he still did it, and it was still worth doing. Socrates said that philosophy is preparing for death. But what I see in this story is somebody who was fully engaged with life and living, albeit the small amount that was left to him. So we should do philosophy. I'm not surprised to hear me say that. And I think we should do something more or less similar to what Socrates and Aristotle and Plato were doing, dialectical philosophy. I think we should have an eye on the instrumental benefits, those that have been shown and those that we're still looking into, but I think we should not forget the non-instrumental value, the value of thinking for the sake of thinking. Thank you very much.